Let's turn today to Matthew's Gospel and chapter 12. At that time, Jesus went on the Sabbath through the grain fields, and his disciples became hungry and began to pick the heads of grain and eat. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Behold, your disciples do what is not lawful to do on a Sabbath." And later on we read in verses 9 to 14 about another incident that occurred on the same Sabbath day, where Jesus healed a man with a withered hand in the synagogue. In both these instances, in the first part of Matthew chapter 12, appeared to be a violation of the Old Testament Sabbath law in the eyes of the Pharisees. And it's very interesting to see that these incidents occurred immediately after Jesus spoke in Matthew 11:28 about giving rest to those who came to him. He spoke about rest in verse 28 and in verse 29. And as we considered in our last study, the rest that Jesus spoke about in Matthew 11:28 and 29 was a fulfillment of that Old Testament Sabbath that Moses gave according to God's commandment, which was fulfilled in that inner rest that Jesus has come to give us under the new covenant. And if we don't understand this rest that Jesus spoke of in Matthew 11:28 and 29, then we shall think much again even today about the external Sabbath keeping that was commanded under the Old Testament. People may say, but keeping the Sabbath was one of the commandments among the 10 commandments. How can we cancel out one of those 10 commandments and say that that doesn't apply to us when we keep the other 9? The reason is that after giving the 10 commandments, God gave a commandment to the Israelites, saying in Exodus chapter 31 and verses 12 to 17, it's a very interesting and important passage if we are to understand that commandment which spoke about keeping the Sabbath. In fact, it is because people have not understood this passage in Exodus 31 nor Hebrews chapter 4 that they make much of the Sabbath today. The Lord spoke to Moses, Exodus 31:12, saying, "As for you, speak to the sons of Israel." This is to the Jewish people who had come out of Egypt. "You shall surely observe my Sabbaths, for this is a sign between me and you Israelites." It's not between me and all the people of the world. That's why we Christians don't keep the Sabbath, because we're not Jews, we're not Israelites. It was a sign between God and the Israeli people throughout their generations, that they may know that He was the Lord who sanctified them. Therefore, you Israelites, Exodus 31:14, are to observe the Sabbath, and the one who does not observe it must be put to death. There's no other punishment. If you don't observe the Sabbath, you have to be put to death. For 6 days work may be done, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of complete rest, and it spoke about physical rest, holy to the Lord. And again a repetition of that punishment. If anyone does work on the Sabbath day, it's not just that he's got to be put out of the church or the synagogue, he's got to be put to death. If you're a Jew, you're an Israelite, that's the only thing to do. So, again a repetition. Not the sons of men or the sons of Adam, but the sons of Israel, Exodus 31:16, shall observe the Sabbath. It does not apply to people who are not the sons of Israel to celebrate the Sabbath throughout their generations as a covenant between God and them. We're not in that covenant. And again a repetition. It is a sign between God, Exodus 31:17, between me and the sons of Israel alone. The sons of Israel forever. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, 7 days ceased from labor and was refreshed. And although the creation applies to all humanity, God has made a 7-day week, yet the Sabbath covenant, it's very clear, based on that original seventh day when God rested is only between God and the Israeli people. It's a sign. That's the reason why that one commandment is different. And that's why in the entire epistles of the New Covenant, you never find a single word telling us to keep the Sabbath. On the contrary, we read in Colossians in chapter 2, let no one judge you, it says in Colossians 2:16, concerning the Sabbath day, which is a mere shadow. Verse 17. Colossians 2:16 and 17 says, the Sabbath day was a shadow, and don't let anybody judge you today concerning keeping that or not keeping it. Because the body belongs to Christ. You've come into the new covenant now. And Jesus was inaugurating the new covenant. And the Pharisees, of course, did not have ears to hear this message. They were not men of violence who were willing to do violence to traditions contrary to God's word. And so when Jesus' disciples were picking the heads of grain and eating, as we read in Matthew 12, verse 1, the Pharisees were upset. They were offended. They told Jesus, your disciples are disobeying God's commandment. They're not keeping the Sabbath. And Jesus defends his disciples and says to the Pharisees in Matthew 12, verse 3, have you not read what David did when he was hungry? He and his companions, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which was kept on the table of showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those with him, but for the priests alone. Was it God's will that David should die of hunger? No. One can keep the letter of the law and not understand its spirit and become a Pharisee. In fact, this is the way the Pharisees became Pharisees, by keeping the letter of the law, not understanding its spirit. Verse 5. What about the law itself? Jesus says, on the Sabbath, the priests in the temple break the Sabbath by working on the Sabbath day in the temple, but they're innocent. He quotes two examples from their old covenant itself and says, would you say that the priests or David broke the Sabbath or did something wrong? No, I say to you, he says in verse 6, something greater than the temple is here. Jesus was greater than that old covenant. The new covenant is greater than the old covenant. Something greater than that Old Testament temple and that old covenant law is here now. But, he said, you can understand this only if you know the meaning of what God said in Hosea 6, verse 6, I desire compassion and not a sacrifice. If you had understood the meaning of that, you would not have condemned the innocent. In other words, Jesus was saying the disciples were innocent in picking the grain fields. Of course, picking it from a field was permitted under the Old Covenant law. What was left over after the harvest had been gleaned. What was left over, the bits here and there, God said, leave it for the poor to come and take. The question in the Pharisees' mind was only whether it was right to pick it on the Sabbath day. And Jesus says that his disciples were innocent, because he said, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. You see, in another context, he said the Sabbath was made for man. Man was not made for the Sabbath. The question is, was man made because God wanted someone to keep his commandments? Or were the commandments made because he wanted man to inherit a glory? It's very clear. The commandments were made for man, not man for the commandments. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. He is the Lord who appointed the Sabbath. And he explains to us here the real meaning, the spirit behind the Sabbath. What he had said earlier in Matthew 11:28 and 29 as well, that inner rest that he longs to give us. Then he went into the synagogue, and they questioned him again, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? All right, you say that it's lawful to pick grain from the fields on the Sabbath. What about healing on the Sabbath? They wanted to accuse him. And he said, if someone of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you lift it out or let it die there? You people haven't understood the meaning of God desires compassion more than sacrifice. Of how much more value than is a man than a sheep? If a man's fallen into a pit on a Sabbath day, will you lift him out? Definitely. Then it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Not to do work doesn't mean that you don't do good to anyone. And he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And he stretched it out and was restored to normal like the other. Mark chapter 3 tells us of the similar incident that Jesus was angry. Mark 3 verses 1 to 6, the parallel passage. He was angry with the Pharisees for having this attitude, this legalistic attitude, that they wouldn't even do good, apparently, to keep the commandment. There can be a righteousness which is apart from goodness, and that righteousness is a counterfeit. If our righteousness is a righteousness that does not have goodness in it, it's a counterfeit. The Pharisees were so angry with Jesus for doing this and for exposing their hypocrisy and their form of godliness without power, that it says in Matthew 12:14 that the Pharisees went out and counseled together against him as to how they might destroy him. Notice, the Pharisees were upset with Jesus, not because he preached purity, but because he exposed them as hypocrites, because he destroyed their unscriptural traditions. It's when we stand against unscriptural traditions that even today the Pharisees can be upset. But Jesus was willing, in order to establish the new covenant, to expose the hypocrisy of religious leaders and to point out the hollowness of their traditions.